My chef husband, Jeremy Blake, demanded I cook my signature dishes for his girlfriend's family restaurant opening, claiming he'd already promised them my award-winning recipes. Consider it a favor for Bella's future, he said with a smirk, knowing I'd discovered their affair just days before. Your cooking will finally serve a worthy purpose. So I agreed to cater their grand opening, but my secret ingredient wasn't listed on any menu.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
The worst part wasn't catching Jeremy with Bella Conrad in our kitchen at midnight, her hands covered in flour from my grandmother's secret sourdough starter. The worst part was realizing he was systematically teaching her my most guarded family recipes. I stood frozen in the doorway of our Denver brownstone, returning early from a catering event at the Ritz-Carlton. The kitchen that had been my sanctuary for 8 years of marriage was now a crime scene. Jeremy was methodically transferring my culinary heritage to another woman, as if my family's 70-year legacy was his property to distribute. The key is the hydration ratio, Jeremy was saying, his voice taking on the professorial tone he used when explaining wine pairings to investors. Vivian's grandmother brought this technique from Tuscany in 1952. The starter has never been refrigerated in 70 years. Bella nodded eagerly, her auburn hair pulled back in the same messy bun I always wore when baking. She was younger than me by at least 7 years, with effortless beauty that didn't require the concealer I'd been using to hide stress lines. But what made my stomach lurch was how she was writing everything down in a leather-bound notebook, documenting every measurement, every technique, every family secret I'd shared with Jeremy during intimate moments. "What about the browning technique for the ossobuco?" Bella asked, and I nearly dropped my knife roll. That recipe had taken me 6 months to perfect, combining techniques from my classical French training with innovations I'd developed during my stage at Osteria Francescana in Modena. I'd never written it down anywhere. Jeremy glanced toward the doorway and our eyes met. For a split second, I saw panic flash across his face. Then his expression hardened into cold calculation. "Perfect timing, Viv," he said, as if I'd been invited to this midnight cooking lesson. "Bella's family is opening a new Italian restaurant in Cherry Creek next month. I told them you'd be happy to help with some recipes." Bella turned around, stunning in the way that made restaurant investors write checks before tasting the food. High cheekbones, expressive green eyes, and a smile that could charm food critics. "Jeremy has told me so much about your incredible talent," she said, extending a flour-dusted hand. "I've been dying to meet the genius behind Harrison's Kitchen." Harrison's Kitchen? My restaurant, the one I'd built from a food truck into a James Beard-nominated establishment over the past decade, the one Jeremy had slowly inserted himself into as business manager until his name appeared on half the paperwork. "What exactly has Jeremy told you?" I asked, not moving from the doorway. "I've been sharing some of your family recipes with the Conrad family," Jeremy said smoothly. "They're opening Nana's Treble next month, and I thought it would be a wonderful way to honor your grandmother's legacy." My grandmother's legacy? The woman who'd made me promise on her deathbed that her sourdough starter would never leave our family, that her techniques would be passed down only to my own children someday. "You told them about Nana Sophia's recipes?" My voice came out as a whisper. "Just the basics," Jeremy said, but his eyes avoided mine. "Nothing proprietary." I looked at Bella's notebook, glimpsing my own handwriting in the margins where Jeremy had obviously photocopied pages from my personal recipe collection, the one I kept locked in my office safe, the one Jeremy had the combination to because I'd trusted him with everything. "How long has this been going on?" I asked. Jeremy and Bella exchanged a look that spoke of inside jokes and shared secrets. "Vivian, you're being dramatic," Jeremy said, moving to stand protectively near Bella. "This is business. The Conrad family has serious investors backing them. This could be profitable for all of us." "Profitable for us or profitable for you?" "The Conrad family appreciates authentic Italian cuisine," Bella added, her voice taking on a slight edge. Jeremy explained that you learned these techniques from your grandmother, but that you don't have the business acumen to scale them properly. The business acumen to scale them properly. I stared at this woman who'd been in my kitchen, using my techniques, writing down my family's history, and she was suggesting I wasn't capable of building my own success. "I think you should leave," I said quietly. After she left, Jeremy and I stood in our kitchen, surrounded by evidence of his betrayal. Flour handprints on my marble counters, my grandmother's sourdough starter sitting uncovered where Bella had been touching it with unwashed hands. The recipe notebook containing 70 years of my family's culinary history, now photographed and documented in a stranger's handwriting. "How long?" I asked again. Jeremy poured himself a glass of the Barolo I'd been saving for our anniversary. 6 months. 6 months. While I'd been working 16-hour days preparing for the James Beard semifinals, while I'd been trusting him with my deepest family secrets and my business future. "The recipes, Jeremy. How many of my recipes have you given her?" "Technically, they're our recipes. We're married, community property." The casual way he said it made my blood freeze. This wasn't a moment of weakness. This was calculated. "Why?" The question came out broken. Jeremy looked at me with something that might have been pity. "Because, Vivian, you're talented, but you're not scalable. You insist on doing everything yourself. You won't franchise. You're holding back your own potential." "So you decided to give my potential to someone else?" "I decided to find someone who understands that business is business. Bella doesn't get emotional about tradition." The man I'd loved for 8 years was standing in our kitchen, explaining why my life's work was better suited for his mistress than for me. "Get out," I said. "This is my house too, Vivian. Get out of my kitchen." After he left, I sat alone until dawn, staring at my grandmother's violated sourdough starter. But as the sun rose over Denver's skyline, I realized Jeremy had made one crucial mistake. He'd taught Bella my recipes, but he hadn't taught her my secrets. The real techniques that made my food special weren't written in any notebook. They were in my hands, my instincts, my understanding of flavors, but had taken decades to develop. Jeremy thought he could replicate me. He was about to learn that some things can't be copied, only earned. 3 days after discovering Jeremy and Bella in my kitchen, I started investigating exactly how deep his betrayal ran. What I found made my blood run cold. This wasn't just an affair or casual sharing of recipes. This was systematic theft spanning months. I began with my recipes. The leather portfolio I kept locked in my office safe had clearly been photographed. Page after page showed subtle signs of having been handled, repositioned, copied. The margins, where I'd written personal notes, had been highlighted with tiny pencil marks, as if someone had been marking the most important details for transcription. But the recipe theft was just the beginning. When I logged into my restaurant's financial management system, I discovered Jeremy had been running reports I'd never authorized. Detailed cost analyses of my signature dishes, supplier contact lists, profit margins broken down by ingredient sourcing. He'd been mining my business for intelligence. The most devastating discovery came when I found his laptop left open, still logged into his email. The subject line stopped me cold. Conrad Family Restaurant, Recipe Implementation Timeline. I opened the email thread between Jeremy and someone named Logan Conrad, dated back 4 months. 4 months before I'd caught them in the kitchen. "Jeremy, my daughter Bella speaks very highly of your wife's techniques," Logan Conrad had written. "We're prepared to offer $50,000 for exclusive rights to the sourdough starter culture and associated bread recipes, an additional $25,000 for the osso buco preparation, and $30,000 for what Bella describes as the secret pasta sauce that changes everything." Mrs. Blake. They weren't even using my professional name. I scrolled down to Jeremy's response. "Logan, I appreciate the Conrad family's interest in Vivian's recipes. However, I think we can structure this more beneficially for everyone involved. Rather than a one-time payment, what if I provided ongoing consultation to help Bella master these techniques? Vivian can be protective of her family traditions, but I'm confident I can manage her concerns.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
He was auctioning off my grandmother's legacy like it was a commodity. The sourdough starter that had traveled from Italy to Ellis Island to Colorado, that represented everything I valued about tradition and continuity. Bella is a fast learner, Jeremy had written 3 weeks ago. She's already mastered the basic pasta technique and is working on the mother sauces. Vivian suspects nothing. She actually seems pleased that I'm taking more interest in her cooking. Pleased that he was taking interest? I remembered those moments with bitter clarity now. Jeremy asking thoughtful questions about my methods, requesting that I teach him family recipes so we can cook together more often. I'd been so happy that my workaholic husband was finally engaging with my passion. The email thread revealed that Logan Conrad owned 6 restaurants in Chicago and was expanding into Denver with serious financial backing. This wasn't a small family restaurant, it was a corporate operation using my stolen recipes to launch a major market expansion. I printed every email, every document. Then I dug deeper, checking our joint credit card statements. The pattern was clear. Expensive dinners at upscale restaurants, charged to our business account but listed as client meetings. Hotel charges in cities where Jeremy claimed to be attending conferences, but the locations didn't match any legitimate industry events. My phone buzzed with a text from Amanda. "Chef Vivian, weird question. Did you authorize someone named Bella Conrad to tour our kitchen yesterday? She was here with Jeremy, asking lots of questions about our prep procedures and taking photos." She'd been in my restaurant, in my kitchen. Jeremy had used my staff's respect for him to give his mistress access to my professional secrets. I called Amanda immediately. "Tell me everything about yesterday." "It was strange, Chef. Jeremy brought this really beautiful woman through during lunch prep. He introduced her as a potential investor, but she seemed especially focused on the pasta station and bread ovens. She asked Marco about the fermentation timing for your sourdough, and she watched him portion the osso buco like she was memorizing the technique. Did she take notes? Photos, mostly, and she recorded Marco explaining the sauce reduction process. Jeremy said it was for a presentation to potential investors, but something felt off. That evening, I confronted Jeremy with printed copies of his emails. He didn't deny anything. Instead, he sat at our kitchen island and calmly explained his reasoning like he was presenting a business proposal. "Vivian, you're thinking like an artist instead of an entrepreneur," he said. "These recipes are sitting in our kitchen generating revenue for one small restaurant when they could be creating jobs and profits across multiple markets. The Conrad family has the resources to scale your techniques properly. They're not just techniques, Jeremy. They're my family's history. And that history will be preserved. Bella is committed to honoring the traditional methods. Bella is committed to stealing them." Jeremy sighed. "This is exactly what I mean. You're too emotional about this. You can't see the business opportunity because you're caught up in sentimentality. And what about us, Jeremy? What about our marriage? Our marriage has been a business partnership for years, Vivian. This is just restructuring the terms." The casual way he dismantled 8 years of what I thought was love left me speechless. "The Conrad family is expecting an answer by Friday," he said. "I suggest you consider their offer seriously. With or without your cooperation, Nana's table is opening next month." After he left, I sat in my violated kitchen and realized the full scope of what I was facing. This wasn't just about stolen recipes or a cheating husband. Jeremy had been systematically positioning himself to steal my entire professional identity. But as I stared at the evidence of his months-long deception, I realized he'd made one crucial error. Jeremy understood my recipes, but he didn't understand me. He'd been so focused on extracting my techniques that he'd never bothered to learn the most important ingredient in everything I cooked: my ability to adapt, survive, and emerge stronger from whatever tried to destroy me. The next morning, I found Amanda already at Harrison's kitchen with something that made my hands shake: a printed article from Denver Food and Wine magazine published 2 days ago. Rising star Bella Conrad brings authentic Italian traditions to Cherry Creek. The article featured a full-page photo of Bella in what was clearly my grandmother's apron, standing beside a wood-fired oven that looked suspiciously similar to mine. But it was the quotes that made me realize Jeremy's betrayal went far deeper than I'd imagined. My family's recipes have been carefully guarded for generations, Bella was quoted saying. My great-grandmother brought these techniques from Tuscany in the early 1900s, and we've maintained the traditional methods ever since. The sourdough starter I use has never been refrigerated in over 70 years. My great-grandmother. My sourdough starter. My story, rewritten with Bella as the protagonist. Conrad credits her business partner and mentor, restaurant consultant Jeremy Blake, with helping her recognize the commercial potential of her family's culinary heritage. Jeremy had orchestrated the entire narrative. He wasn't just stealing my recipes, he was positioning Bella as the innovative young chef improving upon my outdated methods. I called the magazine's food editor. Sarah Federer answered enthusiastically. Chef Harrison, I was just thinking about you after running the Conrad piece. Jeremy Blake submitted the most compelling story about preserving authentic Italian traditions. He provided such detailed background on the family's culinary history. Jeremy submitted the story? Oh yes, he's been working with us for months. He's very passionate about Bella's work. He said you two have been collaborating on menu development. Jeremy had positioned himself as the industry expert who could verify Bella's credentials using his knowledge of my actual methods. Amanda showed me her research on Logan Conrad's business profile. The man owned 14 restaurants across multiple states, not 6 as Jeremy had claimed. His net worth was estimated at over $50 million, and his restaurant group was known for aggressive expansion tactics. He specializes in acquiring family recipes from struggling restaurants, Amanda explained. There's a pattern. He finds talented chefs with unique techniques, offers them partnership deals, then gradually takes control of their recipes and concepts. She showed me articles about 3 different chefs who'd lost their signature dishes to Conrad's aggressive business practices. Maria Santos, whose grandmother's mole recipe now appeared at 5 different Conrad restaurants. David Kim, whose fusion techniques had been replicated across Conrad's Asian-inspired concepts. Elena Rossi, whose family's gelato recipes had been mass-produced and distributed to Conrad's dessert shops. He's done this before, I whispered, multiple times, and Jeremy's name appears in several of these cases as a consultant. The room tilted as I realized the full scope. Jeremy wasn't just my cheating husband, he was a professional recipe thief who specialized in targeting successful female chefs through romantic relationships. Chef, I also found records of a company called Blake Culinary Consulting, registered 18 months ago. Jeremy's been building a business around acquiring and licensing restaurant recipes. For the next 2 hours, Amanda and I pieced together Jeremy's systematic operation. Blake Culinary Consulting had contracts with Logan Conrad's restaurant group to source authentic family recipes from established chefs. Jeremy's role was to identify targets, build relationships, and facilitate transfers. The most damaging discovery came when Amanda found Jeremy's professional website. It showcased his successful culinary acquisitions with before and after photos of restaurants launched using stolen recipes. Harrison's Kitchen was featured prominently in his current project section. But the section that made me physically sick was titled Relationship-Based Acquisition Strategies. Jeremy had written a detailed case study about using romantic relationships to gain access to protected culinary information. The key to successful acquisition is patience, Jeremy had written. Female chefs often guard family recipes more fiercely than business secrets. Traditional negotiation tactics fail because the emotional attachment overrides commercial logic. However, romantic relationships create unique access opportunities. Targets. He called us targets. In each case, Jeremy have written, the target's emotional attachment to the culinary techniques made them vulnerable to relationship-based extraction methods. Love is the most effective tool for accessing protected intellectual property. I stared at my own photo in his portfolio, taken during one of our cooking sessions. The caption read, "Subject shows strong emotional attachment to family traditions. Extraction proceeding ahead of schedule." Subject, not wife, not partner. Subject. "There's one more thing," Amanda said gently. "I found financial records showing Blake Culinary Consulting has already received a $200,000 advance from Conrad's Restaurant Group for the Harrison's Kitchen acquisition." $200,000, the price Jeremy had put on my family's 70-year culinary legacy. I sat in my own restaurant, surrounded by everything I'd built through years of dedication, and realized I wasn't just fighting a cheating husband, I was fighting a criminal organization that specialized in destroying female chefs' lives and careers. But as I stared at the evidence of Jeremy's systematic theft, something shifted inside me. The devastation began crystallizing into something sharper, more focused. Jeremy had made one critical error. He'd assumed that my emotional attachment to my traditions made me weak, that my love for him had made me an easy target. He was about to learn that a woman who'd spent decades perfecting the art of transformation through fire, pressure, and precise timing could apply those same skills to destroying the man who'd tried to steal her soul. That evening, Jeremy came home with expensive champagne, acting as if nothing had changed. He announced he'd scheduled a meeting with Logan Conrad for Friday morning to finalize my consulting agreement with Nana's Table. "Logan is flying in from Chicago specifically to meet you," he said, pouring champagne into my grandmother's crystal glasses. "This is a huge opportunity, Vivian. The Conrad Restaurant Group has locations in 12 cities. Your recipes could be featured coast to coast." I smiled, letting him believe his charm was working. "Tell me more about Logan. What's he like?" Jeremy's eyes lit up as he detailed Logan Conrad's empire with obvious reverence. Logan wasn't just wealthy, he was strategically connected throughout the food industry. His restaurant group had partnerships with hotel chains, catering companies, and food distributors across the Midwest. He sat on the board of the National Restaurant Association and had consulting contracts with 3 major food corporations. More importantly, he had the political and legal connections to make problems disappear for people who threatened his business interests. "He's incredibly influential," Jeremy explained. "Food critics listen to him. Investors trust his judgment. When Logan Conrad recommends a restaurant or a chef, it opens doors that most people spend decades trying to unlock." What Jeremy didn't realize was that he was giving me a detailed briefing on exactly how powerful the enemy I was facing truly was. "How many other chefs has he worked with?" I asked carefully. "Oh, dozens. Logan has a gift for recognizing untapped potential and helping talented chefs reach wider markets. He's particularly good at working with female chefs who have amazing family recipes but lack the business experience to scale them properly." The casual way Jeremy described Logan's pattern of targeting women made my skin crawl. Over the next 2 hours, Jeremy detailed his operation with the pride of an entrepreneur discussing a successful startup. He'd been working with Logan for 3 years, initially as a financial consultant, before recognizing the profit potential in recipe acquisition. "The key is understanding that most family recipes have never been properly valued," Jeremy explained. "These women inherit techniques that could generate millions in revenue, but they're content running single restaurants that barely break even." "What about the chefs who don't want to scale their operations?" I asked. Jeremy's expression darkened slightly. "That's where things can get complicated. Some targets are unreasonably attached to maintaining small-scale operations. In those cases, Logan has methods for encouraging cooperation." "What kind of methods?" "Legal pressure, usually. Copyright infringement claims, business licensing challenges, health department investigations. Logan has excellent attorneys and extensive connections in regulatory agencies." My blood turned to ice. Logan Conrad didn't just steal recipes through seduction and manipulation. He had a network of lawyers, officials, and industry connections that he used to systematically destroy chefs who refused to cooperate. "What about Maria Santos?" I asked. Jeremy's smile faltered. "Maria was difficult. She initially agreed to the partnership, then tried to back out when she realized the full scope of what modernizing her grandmother's recipes would require. She started making accusations about recipe theft." What happened to her? Her restaurant failed 6 months later. Series of unfortunate events. Health department violations, supplier issues, staff problems. Sometimes the market decides which businesses deserve to survive. The market, as if Maria Santos's destruction had been natural selection rather than coordinated sabotage. As Jeremy continued describing Logan's plans for my life's work, I realized that refusing his offer wasn't really an option. Logan Conrad had the resources to destroy Harrison's kitchen whether I cooperated or not. But Jeremy had made one crucial miscalculation. He assumed that my attachment to tradition made me weak, that my love for family recipes meant I couldn't adapt to modern business realities. He was about to discover that a woman who'd spent decades mastering the art of transformation could apply those same skills to evolving far beyond anything he could imagine. Logan Conrad thought he was acquiring another vulnerable female chef whose emotions could be manipulated for profit. Instead, he was about to meet someone who understood his methods better than anyone and had the knowledge necessary to destroy everything he'd built. Jeremy's network was extensive and well-connected, but he'd never encountered a chef who was about to transform herself into something he couldn't recognize, control, or steal from. The meeting was set for Friday morning. By then, I'd need to decide whether to fight Logan Conrad's empire head-on or find a more strategic approach. Either way, Jeremy was about to learn that some recipes require ingredients he'd never heard of. Friday morning arrived with a crisp October chill that matched my mood as I prepared to meet Logan Conrad. I dressed carefully in my best chef's coat and professional blazer, wanting to project confidence and confidence even though my stomach churned with anxiety. This meeting would determine whether I fought Logan's empire as Vivian Harrison, the emotional chef attached to tradition, or found another way to destroy him entirely. The Conrad Restaurant Group had rented a private dining room at the Brown Palace Hotel for our meeting. When I arrived, Logan was already seated at the polished mahogany table, reviewing documents with the focused attention of a man accustomed to controlling every detail of his business operations. He was exactly what I'd expected from Jeremy's descriptions, mid-50s, silver-haired, with the kind of expensive tailoring that whispered wealth rather than shouting it. His handshake was firm, his smile professionally warm, and his eyes held the calculating intelligence of someone who'd built an empire by recognizing opportunities that others missed. "Mrs. Blake," he said, using Jeremy's last name with casual authority, "Jeremy has told me so much about your extraordinary talent. I've been looking forward to this conversation for months." Bella sat beside him, wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than most line cooks made in a month. She looked younger and more innocent in person, but I could see the sharp intelligence behind her friendly facade. This wasn't just Jeremy's accomplice, she was Logan's protégé, trained to identify and exploit the vulnerabilities of other female chefs. "I understand you're interested in licensing some of my family recipes," I said, settling into the chair across from them. Logan's laugh was genuinely delighted. "Mrs. Blake, you're thinking far too small. We're not interested in licensing. We want to offer you a full partnership in revolutionizing how authentic Italian cuisine is presented in American restaurants." For the next hour, Logan outlined his vision with the evangelical fervor of someone who genuinely believed he was saving traditional recipes from obscurity. The Conrad Restaurant Group would establish Vivian Harrison as the premier authority on authentic Italian-American cuisine. My techniques would be featured in a cookbook, a cooking show, and a line of specialty food products sold nationwide. "Your grandmother's sourdough starter alone is worth millions in commercial applications," Logan explained, sliding a contract across the table. "We've had food scientists analyze the samples Jeremy provided, and they've confirmed that the bacterial culture is genuinely unique. With proper cultivation and quality control, we could supply that starter to bakeries and restaurants across the country." Samples Jeremy provided? My husband had been stealing portions of my grandmother's living sourdough culture and sending them to food laboratories for analysis. The violation felt like grave robbing. Of course, we understand that maintaining consistency at scale requires some modernization of traditional methods, Bella added, her voice carefully respectful. But we're committed to preserving the essential character of each recipe while adapting them for contemporary commercial kitchens. I studied the contract they'd prepared, noting the careful language that transferred all intellectual property rights to Conrad Restaurant Group while offering me a consulting fee and small percentage of net profits. The terms looked generous until I realized they were essentially purchasing my family's 70-year culinary legacy for what amounted to middle management compensation. "This is quite comprehensive," I said. "You've obviously put considerable thought into the commercial applications." "We've been planning this expansion for over a year," Logan admitted. "Jeremy identified your techniques as exactly what we needed to differentiate our Italian concepts from the competition. Authenticity is increasingly important to American diners, but most restaurants claiming traditional methods are actually using shortcuts and industrial ingredients." "And you'd maintain the traditional approaches?" Logan and Bella exchanged a look that spoke of conversations I wasn't privy to. "We'd maintain the essence of tradition while ensuring consistent quality and profitable operations," Logan said. "Some modifications are inevitable when scaling artisanal techniques for commercial production." Modifications, the same word Jeremy had used when describing how other chefs' family recipes had been adapted for mass production. I was beginning to understand that maintaining the essence of tradition meant preserving the marketing story while gutting everything that actually made the technique special. "I'd like to understand what happened with Maria Santos," I said. "Jeremy mentioned that her partnership didn't work out as planned." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Logan's professional smile remained in place, but his eyes hardened with the cold calculation of someone who'd eliminated threats to his business before. "Maria was resistant to the collaborative process," he said carefully. "She had difficulty accepting that traditional methods sometimes need updating for modern applications. When we suggested modifications to her grandmother's mole recipe to ensure consistent flavor profiles across multiple locations, she became unreasonably emotional." "What kind of modifications?" "Standardizing spice ratios, replacing some specialty ingredients with more readily available alternatives, adjusting cooking times for commercial equipment," Bella explained. "Nothing that fundamentally changed the recipe's character, but Maria acted as if we were destroying her family's heritage." "What kind of modifications?" "Standardizing spice ratios, replacing some specialty ingredients with more readily available alternatives, adjusting cooking times for commercial equipment," Bella explained. "Nothing that fundamentally changed the recipe's character, but Maria acted as if we were destroying her family's heritage." I could imagine Maria Santos's horror at watching her grandmother's carefully balanced recipe reduced to a formula that could be replicated by untrained cooks using industrial shortcuts. The loss of tradition that Logan and Bella described as reasonable business adaptations. "And when she objected?" "She attempted to withdraw from our partnership agreement," Logan said, his tone suggesting such behavior was both unexpected and unreasonable. "Unfortunately, she'd already provided the recipe details and technique documentation required for our initial development work. When she tried to prevent us from using what she'd voluntarily shared, the situation became legally complicated." Legally complicated? I was beginning to understand Logan's method for dealing with uncooperative chefs. First, extract their recipes through partnership agreements. Then, if they objected to commercial modifications, use legal pressure to prevent them from interfering with Conrad Restaurant Group's profitable implementation of their stolen techniques. I assume Maria's restaurant closed due to these legal complications. Maria's restaurant closed because she was a talented cook but a poor businesswoman, Logan replied smoothly. Running a successful restaurant requires more than traditional recipes. It requires understanding of modern commercial realities, which Maria unfortunately lacked. The coded threat was clear. Cooperate with Logan's vision for commercial modification of my family recipes, or face the same systematic destruction that had ended Maria Santos's career. But as I sat in that elegant hotel dining room, listening to Logan Conrad explain why my grandmother's techniques needed improvement, and Jeremy nod along with plans to industrialize my life's work, something crystallized inside me. These men had spent months studying my techniques, analyzing my business, and planning my professional future without my knowledge or consent. They'd treated my marriage, my recipes, and my restaurant as assets to be acquired through manipulation and intimidation. Logan Conrad expected me to surrender my family's legacy because the alternative was fighting his well-funded legal team and extensive industry connections. Jeremy expected me to accept his betrayal because he'd framed it as an opportunity I was too emotional to appreciate properly. Both of them had made the same fundamental error. They'd assumed that my attachment to tradition made me weak, that my love for authentic techniques meant I couldn't adapt to modern competitive realities. "I need time to consider your proposal," I said, closing the contract without signing it. Logal's expression tightened, almost imperceptibly. Of course. However, I should mention that Nana's table is opening in 3 weeks with or without your formal participation. We'd prefer to have your blessing and collaboration, but the Conrad Restaurant Group is committed to bringing authentic Italian-American cuisine to Denver regardless. The threat was delivered with Logan's trademark professional courtesy, but the message was unmistakable. Sign a contract and receive compensation for the theft of my recipes, or watch helplessly as they used my techniques anyway while I received nothing. "I understand completely," I replied, matching his polite tone while fury burned in my chest. "I'll have an answer for you soon." After leaving the Brown Palace, I sat in my car and realized that Logan Conrad had just made the biggest mistake of his professional career. He'd given me a detailed preview of exactly how he planned to destroy my family's culinary legacy, while assuming I was too traditional and emotional to stop him. What Logan didn't understand was that the most important lesson my grandmother had taught me wasn't about cooking. It was about survival. When someone tries to steal what matters most to you, you don't fight them on their terms. You change the entire game.
That weekend, Logan Conrad's legal and industry network moved with the precision of a military operation designed to pressure me into submission. The first blow came Saturday morning when I arrived at Harrison's Kitchen to find a health inspector conducting an unscheduled examination of my facilities. Inspector Morrison, I read from his badge, as he documented every minor irregularity he could find. We weren't expecting an inspection until next quarter. "Anonymous complaint about food safety violations," he replied without looking up from his clipboard. Someone reported concerns about temperature control and cross-contamination procedures. I watched him photograph a water stain on one wall tile and document a minor scuff mark on my prep table as if they were serious health violations. In 12 years of operation, Harrison's Kitchen had never received anything less than an exemplary rating from the health department. Now, this inspector was treating normal wear and tear like evidence of systematic negligence. "What specific violations were reported?" I asked. Inspector Morrison consulted his notes with theatrical precision. Improper storage of dairy products, inadequate hand-washing facilities, and concerns about the bacterial safety of fermented ingredients maintained at room temperature. Fermented ingredients maintained at room temperature? Someone had specifically reported my grandmother's sourdough starter, knowing that explaining its 70-year maintenance tradition would sound like dangerous food handling to bureaucrats who didn't understand artisanal fermentation. "The sourdough culture has been maintained safely for decades," I explained. "It's a traditional method that predates modern refrigeration." "Ma'am, I don't make the regulations. Room temperature fermentation without proper documentation of bacterial testing represents a potential health hazard." For the next 3 hours, Inspector Morrison documented every aspect of my kitchen operation with obsessive attention to minor details that had never been problems before. When he finished, he handed me a violation notice requiring immediate corrections to maintain my operating license. The violations were technically accurate but completely unreasonable. Requiring bacterial testing for my sourdough starter would cost thousands of dollars monthly and destroy the natural culture that made it unique.
Demanding temperature monitoring equipment for every prep surface would require renovations that could shut down my kitchen for weeks. You have 10 business days to address these issues, Inspector Morrison said. Failure to comply will result in temporary closure pending full remediation. 10 business days, exactly enough time for Nana's table to open using my stolen recipes, while my restaurant faced forced closure for health violations that had never existed before I refused Logan Conrad's partnership offer. Monday morning brought the second wave of Logan's pressure campaign. My flour supplier called to inform me that they could no longer provide the specialty Italian ingredients I'd been purchasing for 8 years. "I'm sorry, Chef Harrison," said Alan Federer, the sales manager I'd worked with since opening my restaurant. "Corporate has decided to discontinue our specialty imports due to inconsistent demand." Inconsistent demand? I'd been ordering the same quantities monthly for years, but now my reliable suppliers were suddenly finding my business unprofitable. "What about our contract?" I asked. "The contract includes provisions for discontinuation of specialty products that don't meet minimum volume requirements. I'm afraid your orders fall below our new thresholds." New thresholds that had apparently been implemented over the weekend, specifically designed to exclude my restaurant from accessing the authentic ingredients that made my dishes unique. Tuesday brought a letter from my insurance company informing me that my liability coverage was being canceled due to elevated risk factors associated with traditional food preparation methods. The letter specifically cited concerns about fermented ingredients and handmade pasta techniques that could pose contamination risks in commercial settings. By Wednesday, I understood the full scope of Logan's systematic pressure campaign. My credit line was frozen, pending review of my changing business circumstances. My wine distributor informed me that they could no longer provide the Italian vintages I'd been serving for years. Even my linen service found reasons to terminate our contract, claiming concerns about potential health code violations at my establishment. By Wednesday, I understood the full scope of Logan's systematic pressure campaign. My credit line was frozen, pending review of my changing business circumstances. My wine distributor informed me that they could no longer provide the Italian vintages I'd been serving for years. Even my linen service found reasons to terminate our contract, claiming concerns about potential health code violations at my establishment. Jeremy watched this systematic destruction of my business with the detached interest of someone observing a scientific experiment. When I confronted him about the obvious coordination of these sudden problems, he shrugged with casual indifference. "Maybe this is the market telling you something," he said, not looking up from his laptop. "Running a small restaurant is increasingly difficult without corporate support. Logan's offer is still available." Corporate support, as if Logan Conrad's protection racket was a legitimate business service rather than systematic extortion. "You orchestrated this," I said. "I didn't orchestrate anything. I simply mentioned to Logan that you might need some time to understand the realities of operating without industry connections. He may have shared that information with colleagues who have their own business considerations." The casual way Jeremy described economic terrorism made my blood boil. He was treating the destruction of my livelihood like a natural consequence of my failure to appreciate his guidance. Thursday morning, Amanda called in tears. "Chef, I'm so sorry. I have to give notice. My husband just got laid off from his construction job, and we can't afford for me to work somewhere that might close down." One by one, my staff began finding reasons to leave. Some received job offers they couldn't refuse at restaurants owned by Logan's associates. Others discovered that their unemployment benefits would be jeopardized if they continued working for a business facing health department violations. By Friday, I was running Harrison's Kitchen with a skeleton crew, serving a reduced menu to the few customers who weren't deterred by whispered rumors about health problems and business instability. That evening, Logan Conrad called personally to check on my decision regarding his partnership offer. "Mrs. Blake, I understand you've been experiencing some operational challenges this week," he said, his voice carrying the false sympathy of an arsonist offering to sell fire insurance. "Running an independent restaurant is increasingly difficult in today's competitive environment." "What do you want, Logan?" I want to help you understand that fighting market forces is futile. The Conrad Restaurant Group can solve all of your current problems with a simple partnership agreement. Your suppliers, your insurance, your staff retention issues, all of these challenges disappear when you have proper industry support. The offer was as smooth as poisoned honey. Surrender my family's recipes and accept subordinate status in Logan's empire, and all of my systematic problems would magically resolve themselves. And if I continue to refuse? Logan's sigh carried the weariness of a patient teacher dealing with a stubborn student. Then you'll discover that independent restaurants without industry connections face increasingly difficult operating conditions. Market forces can be quite unforgiving to businesses that resist evolution. Market forces, the same phrase Jeremy had used to describe Maria Santos's destruction. I need more time to consider. Of course, however, I should mention that Nana's Table opens Monday evening with a menu featuring several dishes inspired by traditional Italian-American techniques. We've received remarkable advance interest from food critics and investors. It would be unfortunate if Harrison's Kitchen couldn't remain open to appreciate how your grandmother's legacy will be honored in our interpretation. The threat was delivered with Logan's characteristic politeness, but the message was clear. Watch helplessly as he profited from my stolen recipes while my own restaurant crumbled under systematic pressure, or surrender and receive token compensation for my family's culinary heritage. After hanging up, I sat in my empty restaurant and realized that Logan Conrad had succeeded in isolating me completely. My suppliers were gone, my staff was leaving, my insurance was canceled, and my business was facing imminent closure. But as I stared at my grandmother's sourdough starter, still alive and thriving despite every attempt to regulate it out of existence, I realized that Logan had made the same mistake that every conqueror makes when facing someone with nothing left to lose. He'd assumed that destroying my current life would force me to accept his terms. Instead, he'd freed me from every constraint that had kept me fighting by his rules. Logan Conrad wanted to steal my identity and profit from my family's legacy. He was about to discover that some things become more dangerous when you try to kill them. I had 6 days before Nana's Table opened with my stolen recipes. Time enough to transform myself into something Logan Conrad had never encountered before. A chef who'd learned that the most important ingredient in any recipe was the willingness to burn everything down and start over. Saturday morning, I stood in my empty restaurant kitchen, surrounded by the wreckage of everything I'd built over 12 years. The silence was deafening after decades of familiar sounds. Sizzling pans, chopping knives, the gentle bubble of sauces reducing, the comfortable chatter of my staff preparing for another successful service. Now there was only the hum of refrigeration units cooling ingredients I could no longer afford to replace, and the steady drip of a faucet that Inspector Morrison had photographed as evidence of potential sanitation concerns. My phone had been ringing all morning with cancellations. The Denver Business Coalition had withdrawn their catering contract for next month's charity gala, citing concerns about my restaurant's uncertain operational status. The Food and Wine Festival that had featured Harrison's Kitchen for 3 consecutive years suddenly found my application incomplete and requested additional documentation that would take weeks to obtain. Even my regular customers were disappearing. Mrs. Chen, who'd brought her family for Sunday dinner every week for 5 years, called to cancel their reservation. Her voice was apologetic but firm. "We heard there might be some problems with the health department," she said. "With my mother's compromised immune system, we can't take any risks." Problems with the health department. The rumor mill was working exactly as Logan Conrad had intended. By Monday, half of Denver would believe that Harrison's Kitchen was a health hazard that had been shut down for safety violations. I walked through my dining room, looking at the empty tables where families had celebrated anniversaries, where couples had shared first dates, where food critics had discovered dishes that launched my reputation. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd sacrificed to build, was being systematically destroyed by men who saw my life's passion as a commodity to be acquired through manipulation and force. Jeremy found me there an hour later, sitting at table 12, where we'd celebrated our 3rd wedding anniversary. He'd taken me to dinner that night, told me he was proud of everything I'd accomplished, promised we'd grow old together, creating beautiful food and beautiful memories. "Vivian, this doesn't have to be the end," he said, sitting across from me with the same concerned expression he'd worn when discussing my need for professional therapy. "Logan called this morning. He's willing to restructure the partnership terms if you're ready to be reasonable." Reasonable. The word that men like Jeremy used when they wanted women to surrender their power while pretending the choice was voluntary. What kind of restructuring? A consulting position with guaranteed income, 40% of net profits from dishes based on your recipes instead of the 25% originally offered. Plus, you'd maintain creative control over menu development for the first year. Creative control for the first year, after which Logan would gradually phase out my involvement while keeping my recipes permanently. It was a more generous prison sentence, but still a prison. And Harrison's kitchen? Jeremy's pause told me everything I needed to know before he spoke. The lease expires next month. With your current operational challenges, it would be difficult to renew, but the Conrad Restaurant Group might be interested in acquiring the location for a second Nana's Table once they establish the flagship. They wanted to open their stolen recipe restaurant in my space, using my equipment, serving my food to my former customers while I watched from the sidelines as a paid consultant with no real authority. "Jeremy, do you ever feel guilty about what you've done to me?" The question seemed to surprise him. He studied my face as if trying to understand why I would ask something so illogical. "Guilty? Vivian, I've spent 8 years of my life helping you build something remarkable. Now I'm trying to help you scale that success beyond what you could achieve alone. Why would I feel guilty about creating opportunities?" He genuinely didn't understand that he'd betrayed me. In Jeremy's mind, his systematic theft of my recipes and destruction of my business was a gift I was too emotional to appreciate properly. What about our marriage? Our marriage has been a partnership. Now we're restructuring the terms to be more professionally advantageous for both of us. Bella understands the business side of the restaurant industry in ways that will complement your creative talents. Bella, he was planning a future where his business partner and mistress would manage the commercial aspects of my family's recipes while I provided culinary consultation. A neat triangle where Jeremy controlled both the woman who created the food and the woman who sold it. "Jeremy, do you ever feel guilty about what you've done to me?" The question seemed to surprise him. He studied my face as if trying to understand why I would ask something so illogical. "Guilty? Vivian, I've spent 8 years of my life helping you build something remarkable. Now I'm trying to help you scale that success beyond what you could achieve alone. Why would I feel guilty about creating opportunities?" He genuinely didn't understand. That he'd betrayed me. In Jeremy's mind, his systematic theft of my recipes and destruction of my business was a gift I was too emotional to appreciate properly. What about our marriage? Our marriage has been a partnership. Now we're restructuring the terms to be more professionally advantageous for both of us. Bella understands the business side of the restaurant industry in ways that will complement your creative talents. Bella, he was planning a future where his business partner and mistress would manage the commercial aspects of my family's recipes while I provided culinary consultation. A neat triangle where Jeremy controlled both the woman who created the food and the woman who sold it. So I'd be working for you and Bella? You'd be working with us. Vivian, you're thinking about this emotionally instead of strategically. Logan is offering you the chance to preserve your grandmother's legacy while building a national brand around your techniques. Isn't that what every chef dreams of? Every chef dreams of seeing their work appreciated and respected, but Jeremy was describing the complete commercialization of my family's history, reduced to marketing slogans and standardized recipes that could be replicated by corporate line cooks who'd never heard my grandmother's stories about surviving the Depression through careful food preservation and creative substitutions. "I need to think about it," I said. Jeremy's expression hardened slightly. "Logan is flying back to Chicago tomorrow evening. This offer expires when he leaves Denver." The ultimatum was delivered with the same false regret Jeremy had used when explaining why he couldn't attend my mother's funeral last year because of a critical business meeting that I now realized had probably been a planning session with Logan and Bella. After Jeremy left, I called the 3 staff members who hadn't already found other jobs. Marco, my pasta chef, who'd learned his techniques from his grandmother in Bologna. Lisa, my pastry chef, who'd worked beside me for 7 years. And James, my sommelier, who'd helped me build a wine program that complemented my menu perfectly. All 3 conversations were heartbreaking variations of the same theme. They loved working at Harrison's Kitchen, they respected what we'd built together, but they couldn't afford to wait and see whether my business would survive Logan Conrad's systematic destruction. Chef Vivian, Marco said, his accent thick with emotion, "If there was any way, but my wife, she is pregnant with our 2nd child. I have a job offer from Trattoria Milano. It's not the same as working with you, but it's steady work." Lisa's call was even more painful. Harrison's Kitchen taught me everything I know about real pastry work, but I've been accepted to the Culinary Institute in San Francisco. If I don't take this chance now, I might never get another opportunity to advance my career. James didn't even pretend the decision was about money or opportunity. "Chef, someone called the wine distributors and suggested that my purchasing practices might be questionable. Nothing specific, just enough concern to make them nervous about working with me. I've been offered a position with a restaurant group that has better industry connections." By Sunday evening, I was completely alone. No staff, no suppliers, no customers, no allies in the industry that had been my life for over a decade. Logan Conrad had succeeded in isolating me so thoroughly that signing his partnership agreement seemed like the only alternative to watching my restaurant die a slow, humiliating death. But as I sat in my empty kitchen that night, sharing a simple meal of pasta and olive oil with my grandmother's sourdough starter bubbling peacefully beside me, I realized something that Logan and Jeremy had never understood. They'd assumed that destroying my restaurant would break my spirit and force me to surrender. Instead, they'd stripped away every distraction that had kept me from seeing the situation clearly. I wasn't just fighting for Harrison's Kitchen anymore. I was fighting for every female chef who'd been manipulated out of her recipes, every family tradition that had been stolen and commercialized, every woman who'd trusted a man with her most precious secrets, only to discover that love was just another business strategy. Logan Conrad had systematically destroyed my current life, but he'd also freed me from every constraint that had kept me playing by conventional rules. Jeremy thought he understood my weaknesses because he'd spent 8 years studying my emotional attachments and professional vulnerabilities. What he'd never learned was my greatest strength, the ability to transform pressure and heat into something entirely new. Logan's ultimatum expired tomorrow evening. By then, I needed to decide whether to surrender my family's legacy for financial compensation or find a way to destroy his empire before he could profit from my grandmother's 70-year-old secrets. The choice was becoming clearer with every passing hour. Some recipes required the complete destruction of their original ingredients before they could become something magnificent. Monday morning, I drove to a part of Denver I'd never visited before, following directions scrawled on a napkin from a conversation I'd had 3 months ago with a line cook who'd been fired from one of Logan Conrad's Chicago restaurants. At the time, I thought Maria Santos was just a bitter ex-employee when she'd approached me after a food industry conference, warning me about Blake Culinary Consulting and the Conrad Restaurant Group's predatory practices. Now I understood that Maria had been trying to save me from the same systematic destruction that had ended her own career. I found her at Cocina del Pueblo, a small community kitchen in a converted warehouse that served the Latino population in North Denver. When I walked through the door, the familiar sounds and smells of a working kitchen welcomed me like an embrace from an old friend, even though everything here was different from the upscale world I'd inhabited for the past decade. Maria was teaching a cooking class to a group of immigrant women, demonstrating how to stretch traditional recipes to feed large families on limited budgets. She looked up when I entered, and recognition flickered across her face, followed immediately by something that might have been pity. Chef Harrison, she said, wiping her hands on a towel that had seen better days. I wondered when you'd find your way here. The women in her class studied me with curious eyes, taking in my expensive chef's coat and professional knife roll, obvious markers of privilege in a place where cooking was survival rather than artistry. I need to understand what really happened to your restaurant, I said. Maria dismissed her class with gentle instructions to practice the techniques they'd learned, then led me to a small office that smelled of cumin and desperation. The walls were covered with photos of the restaurant she'd lost, newspaper clippings documenting her grandmother's immigration story, and what looked like legal documents marked with red stamps indicating final notices and court judgments. Logan Conrad destroyed everything I'd spent 15 years building, she said, settling into a chair that had been repaired with duct tape. But not before he stole my grandmother's mole recipe and turned it into a commercial sauce that's now sold in 43 restaurants across the Midwest. She pulled out a folder thick with documentation that told the story of a systematic campaign designed to steal her family's culinary heritage. Partnership agreements that looked generous until you read the fine print, transferring all intellectual property rights to Conrad Restaurant Group. Legal challenges claiming that her traditional preparation methods violated food safety regulations. Supplier contracts mysteriously canceled just before her busiest season. The worst part wasn't losing my restaurant, Maria continued, showing me photos of the vibrant establishment that had once been her life's work. It was watching them serve my grandmother's mole to customers who had no idea they were eating stolen recipes. Logan took everything that made our food special and turned it into a corporate product that could be replicated by anyone with basic cooking skills. I studied the timeline Maria had created, documenting how Blake Culinary Consulting had targeted her restaurant through a series of increasingly intrusive business consultations that had gradually extracted her most valuable recipes and techniques. The pattern was identical to what Jeremy had been doing to me, but Maria had recognized the theft too late to stop it. How many other chefs has Logan done this to? I found evidence of at least 12 restaurants over the past 5 years, all owned by women, all featuring family recipes with commercial potential, all destroyed through the same systematic process. Maria opened another folder containing newspaper clippings and business records. Elena Rossi's gelato shop in Phoenix, Carmen Rodriguez's tamale restaurant in Albuquerque, Jennifer Kim's fusion concept in Portland. The pattern is always the same. Looking at the photos of these destroyed businesses, I saw my own future if I surrendered to Logan's ultimatum. My grandmother's recipes would be mass-produced and distributed across his restaurant empire, while I received token compensation and watched helplessly as my family's legacy was commercialized beyond recognition. What about fighting back through legal channels? Maria's laugh was bitter. Logan has teams of attorneys and connections in every regulatory agency that matters. When I tried to sue for recipe theft, they buried me in motions and appeals that cost more money than I could afford. When I went to the media, suddenly I was a disgruntled former business partner making unfounded accusations against a respected industry leader. She showed me articles from Chicago food magazines that portrayed Logan as an innovative restaurateur helping small business owners scale their operations, while Maria was characterized as a difficult woman who couldn't adapt to modern business practices. The industry closed ranks around him, Maria explained. Logan sits on the boards of 3 culinary organizations and has donated millions to culinary schools. When he says someone is making false accusations, people listen. But as Maria continued describing Logan's systematic campaign against her, I noticed something she might not have seen herself. Her current operation, teaching traditional cooking techniques to immigrant families, was having an impact that went far beyond the single restaurant she'd lost. How many people have you taught since losing your restaurant? About 200 women so far. They come here to learn how to cook traditional foods for their families, but they leave understanding that their recipes have value and history worth preserving. 200 women who now understood the commercial potential of their family recipes and had been warned about predatory business practices that targeted traditional techniques. Maria had turned her own destruction into a form of cultural preservation and education that Logan's corporate empire could never replicate. What if there was a way to expose Logan's systematic theft to a wider audience? Maria's expression sharpened with interest. I've tried going to food journalists, but Logan's advertising budget buys a lot of editorial discretion. Most publications won't risk losing Conrad Restaurant Group's ad revenue to investigate one woman's accusations. What about industry events, places where food professionals gather and Logan's reputation matters? The National Restaurant Association conference is next month in Las Vegas. Logan's giving the keynote address about authentic cuisine and cultural preservation. The irony would be funny if it wasn't so infuriating. A keynote address about authentic cuisine and cultural preservation. Logan Conrad positioning himself as a champion of traditional cooking methods while systematically stealing those same traditions from the women who'd inherited them. Maria, what if we could document Logan's pattern of theft so thoroughly that even his industry connections couldn't ignore the evidence? For the first time since I'd entered her kitchen, Maria's expression showed something approaching hope. What did you have in mind? I spent the next hour outlining a plan that had been forming in my mind since Logan's ultimatum expired. Instead of fighting his empire through legal channels he controlled or media outlets he influenced, we'd expose his systematic theft at the industry conference, where his peers would witness his destruction firsthand. We'd need the other victims to participate, I said, women who could document their losses and testify about Logan's methods. Most of them are too afraid or too broken to fight back. Logan made sure of that. Then we find a way to give them hope that fighting back might actually work this time. Maria studied my face with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to recognize false promises and empty gestures. Chef Harrison, what makes you think you can succeed where the rest of us failed? It was a fair question. I'd lost my restaurant, my staff, my suppliers, and my marriage in the span of 2 weeks. Logan had systematically destroyed everything I'd built while Jeremy watched with casual indifference. By every conventional measure, I should be preparing to surrender my family's recipes and accept whatever terms Logan offered. But sitting in Maria's community kitchen, surrounded by evidence of Logan's systematic destruction of female chefs' dreams, I realized something that had taken weeks of devastation to understand clearly. Logan's greatest weapon wasn't his legal team or his industry connections. It was his victims' isolation and despair. He counted on destroyed women being too broken to organize effective resistance against his empire. Because I'm not fighting for my restaurant anymore, I told Maria. I'm fighting for every woman whose recipes he's stolen, every family tradition he's commercialized, every chef who trusted the wrong man with her most precious secrets. Maria nodded slowly. And what happens to you after we destroy Logan's reputation? Your restaurant is still gone, your marriage is still over, your career is still ruined. Then I'll build something new, something he can never steal because it belongs to all of us. For the first time since I'd met her, Maria Santos smiled. Chef Harrison, I think we need to make some phone calls. The transformation began that night in Maria's community kitchen, but it wasn't the kind of change Jeremy would have recognized. While he'd spent months documenting my recipes and techniques, he'd never understood the most important skill my grandmother had taught me: how to reinvent yourself when survival demanded it.
Mariah had gathered 3 other women whose restaurants had been destroyed by Logan's systematic theft. Elena Rossi, the gelato maker from Phoenix, whose family recipes now appeared in Conrad's dessert shops across Arizona. Carmen Rodriguez, whose tamale techniques had been mass-produced for Logan's Tex-Mex chains throughout Texas, and Jennifer Kim, whose Korean-Italian fusion concepts had been replicated in 6 cities after Blake Culinary Consulting consulted her into bankruptcy. We tried fighting him individually, Elena said, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd spent years in fruitless legal battles. Logan's attorneys buried us in paperwork and appeals until we ran out of money. The media wouldn't touch the story, Carmen added. One food blogger called us bitter women who couldn't handle business competition. Jennifer nodded grimly. Logan made sure we looked like disgruntled former partners rather than theft victims. He controls too much of the narrative.
But as I listened to their stories, I realized they'd all made the same mistake I'd been about to make. They'd tried to fight Logan Conrad as the women he'd destroyed, rather than transforming into something he couldn't recognize or control. What if we stopped being his victims? I asked. What if we became something entirely different? Over the next hour, I outlined the plan that had been crystallizing in my mind since Logan's ultimatum expired. We wouldn't fight him as ruined restaurant owners seeking justice for past theft. We'd transform ourselves into culinary investigators, exposing his ongoing crimes to an industry audience that had never seen the evidence presented systematically. The National Restaurant Association conference has 3,000 attendees, I explained. Food critics, restaurant investors, culinary school administrators, industry executives. Logan's keynote address about authentic cuisine will be the perfect platform to expose his hypocrisy. How? Maria asked. Conference security won't let us disrupt his speech. We don't disrupt it, we enhance it. We register as legitimate conference participants, set up exhibits documenting Logan's pattern of theft, and present our evidence as a panel discussion on protecting culinary intellectual property. Elena's eyes sharpened with interest. We could document every restaurant he's destroyed, every recipe he's stolen, every woman he's manipulated. Make it impossible to dismiss us as isolated complaints. But we'd need credibility, Carmen pointed out. Logan's reputation gives him authority. Who's going to listen to a group of failed restaurant owners making accusations? That was the key insight that would make everything possible. We couldn't present ourselves as Logan's victims because victims don't have credibility in business settings. We needed to become experts, researchers, advocates for an issue bigger than our personal grievances. We become a culinary preservation organization, I said, dedicated to protecting traditional recipes from commercial exploitation. We present Logan's systematic theft as a case study in cultural appropriation and intellectual property abuse. Jennifer leaned forward, understanding immediately. We position ourselves as industry watchdogs rather than revenge-seeking former business partners. Exactly. We research other cases of recipe theft, document the economic impact on small restaurants, interview food historians about cultural preservation. We build a comprehensive analysis of predatory practices in the restaurant industry. Mariah was already making notes. I have contacts at 3 culinary schools who've been concerned about corporate exploitation of traditional techniques. They might be willing to participate in a panel discussion. And I know food journalists who've been investigating the consolidation of independent restaurants, Elena added. They might be interested in a story about systematic theft by major restaurant groups. Over the next 3 hours, we transformed from Logan Conrad's discarded victims into the founding members of the Traditional Culinary Heritage Foundation, a research organization dedicated to protecting family recipes from commercial exploitation. The irony was perfect. Logan had destroyed our individual restaurants, but his systematic cruelty had created the coalition that would expose his entire operation to industry scrutiny. By dawn, we had a plan that was audacious enough to work. We'd register for the conference as culinary preservation advocates, present Logan's theft pattern as academic research, and time our revelation to coincide with his keynote address about authentic cuisine and cultural preservation. What about funding? Carmen asked as we prepared to leave. Conference registration, travel expenses, exhibit materials. We're all broke because of Logan.
I thought about the money Jeremy had been paid for my stolen recipes. The $200,000 advance from Conrad Restaurant Group that had funded my family's destruction. Logan had used my grandmother's techniques to finance his own expansion while systematically destroying my business. I have savings he doesn't know about, I said. Enough to fund our research and conference participation. What I didn't mention was that transforming into someone Logan couldn't recognize would require sacrifices beyond money. I'd need to reinvent my professional identity, abandon the upscale culinary world that had defined my career, and commit to a mission that might never restore what I'd lost. But as I looked around Maria's community kitchen at 3 women who'd survived Logan's systematic destruction and emerged stronger, I realized transformation wasn't about getting back what had been stolen. It was about becoming something more dangerous than anything your enemies could imagine. Logan Conrad thought he'd eliminated 4 threats to his empire by destroying our restaurants. He was about to discover he'd created a coalition that understood his methods better than anyone and had nothing left to lose. Jeremy had spent 8 years studying my techniques, but he'd never learned my most important recipe, how to emerge from complete destruction as something entirely new. The Traditional Culinary Heritage Foundation's first case study would be the systematic theft practices of Blake Culinary Consulting and the Conrad Restaurant Group. Logan's keynote address about authentic cuisine was 3 weeks away. By then, we'd be ready to serve him a dish he'd never tasted before: the consequences of underestimating women who'd learned to transform pain into power. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of intensive preparation that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with cooking in the first place. Not the glamorous world of restaurant reviews and James Beard nominations, but the fundamental satisfaction of taking raw ingredients and transforming them into something entirely new through careful technique and relentless determination. Maria's Community Kitchen became our headquarters as we assembled the most comprehensive documentation of culinary theft ever compiled. Elena drove in from Phoenix with boxes of legal documents, financial records, and photographs showing how her grandmother's gelato recipes had been mass-produced and distributed across Logan's dessert shops. Carmen arrived from Albuquerque with recorded interviews she'd conducted with 3 former Conrad Restaurant Group employees who'd witnessed the systematic extraction of her tamale techniques. Jennifer brought the most damaging evidence from Portland: internal emails she'd obtained through a former business partner, showing Blake Culinary Consulting's detailed analysis of her Korean-Italian fusion concept and their plans for replicating her signature dishes across multiple markets without crediting her innovation. "Look at this," Jennifer said, showing us an email thread between Jeremy and Logan discussing her restaurant's acquisition potential. They analyzed my customer demographics, profit margins, and signature dishes like they were shopping for real estate. I recognized Jeremy's clinical language from his assessment of my own restaurant, the same detached evaluation of creative work as commercial property to be acquired through manipulation rather than collaboration. But the most powerful evidence came from sources Logan had never anticipated. Dr. Amelia Archer, a food historian from the University of Colorado, had been researching the economic impact of recipe appropriation on immigrant communities for her doctoral dissertation. When Maria contacted her about our project, she provided academic context that transformed our personal grievances into a scholarly analysis of cultural exploitation. What Logan Conrad does isn't just business competition, Dr. Archer explained during one of our planning sessions. It's a systematic erasure of cultural heritage for commercial profit. When traditional recipes are extracted from their communities and mass-produced without context or compensation, it destroys the social bonds that give those techniques meaning. Her research revealed that Logan's theft pattern extended beyond individual restaurants to entire communities. Mexican-American neighborhoods in Chicago had lost 3 traditional bakeries after Conrad Restaurant Group consulted their owners into partnership agreements that gradually stripped away their authentic techniques. Korean family restaurants in Los Angeles had been forced to compete with Conrad's fusion chains using stolen variations of their grandmother's recipes.
We spent 18-hour days assembling timelines, conducting interviews, and creating visual presentations that would make Logan's systematic theft impossible to dismiss as isolated business disputes. The Traditional Culinary Heritage Foundation's exhibit would span 12 display panels documenting 15 different restaurants that had been destroyed through Blake Culinary Consulting's predatory practices. During the final week of preparation, I received an unexpected call from Bella Conrad. Her voice carried none of the confident authority I remembered from our kitchen encounter months ago. "Vivian, I need to see you," she said. "There are things about Logan and Jeremy that you need to know before the conference." We met at a coffee shop in neutral territory, and I barely recognized the woman who sat across from me. Dawn was the polished confidence and designer clothing. Bella looked exhausted, haunted by something that had drained the life from her eyes. "Jeremy didn't tell you the truth about our relationship," she began. "I'm not his girlfriend or his business partner. I'm his latest target." Over the next hour, Bella revealed that she'd been recruited by Blake Culinary Consulting under false pretenses 18 months ago. Logan had approached her family's struggling restaurant in Chicago, offering business consultation that gradually transformed into systematic extraction of their traditional recipes. "My grandmother's techniques are over 100 years old," Bella explained. "Logan convinced my father that modernizing them for commercial production would save our restaurant from bankruptcy, but every modification they made stripped away what made our food special." When Bella had objected to the commercialization of her family's heritage, Logan had offered her a choice: participate in their expansion strategy or watch her family's restaurant fail under the same systematic pressure they'd applied to other uncooperative targets. "Jeremy seduced me into believing I was his partner rather than his victim," she continued. "He made me think I was special, that I understood business realities other women couldn't grasp. It took months to realize I was just another mark in his acquisition strategy." The revelation hit me like cold water. Bella wasn't Jeremy's accomplice, she was another victim who'd been manipulated into helping him steal my recipes. Her confident performance during our meetings had been coached behavior, trained responses designed to make her seem like a willing participant, rather than another woman being exploited for her family's culinary heritage. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because Logan's planning something at the conference that goes beyond stealing your recipes. He knows about your foundation and your panel presentation. He's preparing a counter-narrative that will destroy your credibility before you can expose his practices." Bella pulled out her phone and showed me text messages from Jeremy discussing their plan to discredit our research by portraying us as a conspiracy of bitter ex-business partners making unfounded accusations against a respected industry leader. They have statements from restaurant critics, testimonials from satisfied Conrad Restaurant Group partners, and expert witnesses who'll testify that your evidence is fabricated or taken out of context. Logan had anticipated our exposure attempt and was prepared to neutralize it through the same systematic manipulation he'd used to destroy our individual restaurants. Once again, he was positioning himself as the reasonable businessman defending against emotional women who couldn't accept market realities. But as Bella continued describing Logan's defensive strategy, I realized he'd made the same mistake that every tyrant makes when facing organized resistance. He'd assumed that his victims would fight using the same methods that had failed them individually. He hadn't anticipated that our transformation into culinary preservation advocates would give us resources and credibility he couldn't easily dismiss. "Bella, what if I told you there was a way to expose Logan's manipulation that he couldn't counter with expert testimony or character assassination?" "What do you mean?" "What if the Traditional Culinary Heritage Foundation's real secret weapon wasn't our documentation of past theft, but our ability to demonstrate his methods in real time?" For the first time since she'd arrived, Bella's expression showed something resembling hope. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying that Logan Conrad is about to discover that some recipes require ingredients he never learned to recognize." The conference began in 4 days. By then, the Traditional Culinary Heritage Foundation would be ready to serve Logan Conrad a dish that would change his appetite forever. The Las Vegas Convention Center buzzed with the energy of 3,000 food industry professionals gathering for the National Restaurant Association's annual conference. I walked through the registration area wearing a tailored blazer and carrying credentials that identified me as Dr. Vivian Harrison, Director of Research for the Traditional Culinary Heritage Foundation. The transformation was more than cosmetic. Over the past month, I'd completed an accelerated online certification in food history and cultural preservation from UC Davis. My business cards listed a Denver address for our foundation, complete with a professional website documenting our mission to protect traditional recipes from commercial exploitation. Logan Conrad would be delivering his keynote address on preserving authentic cuisine in modern markets in 3 hours. He had no idea that the woman he'd systematically destroyed was now positioned to expose his hypocrisy to the most influential audience in the restaurant industry. Dr. Harrison, welcome to the conference, said Sky Morrison, the registration coordinator who'd processed our foundation's exhibit application. Your research on recipe appropriation has generated significant advance interest. Several food journalists have requested interviews. The legitimacy we'd built over the past month was working exactly as planned. Instead of being dismissed as disgruntled former restaurant owners, we were being treated as credible researchers, contributing to important industry discussions about cultural preservation and intellectual property protection. Maria, Elena, Carmen, and Jennifer had registered as our foundation's research team, each with credentials that positioned them as experts in different aspects of culinary heritage protection. Dr. Amelia Archer had agreed to serve as our academic advisor, lending additional scholarly credibility to our presentation. Our exhibit booth occupied prime real estate near the main conference hall, strategically positioned where attendees would pass it before and after Logan's keynote address. 12 display panels told the story of systematic recipe theft through carefully documented case studies that made Logan's pattern impossible to dismiss as coincidence. "This is remarkable work," said Larry Federer, the food critic from Food and Wine magazine who'd stopped to examine our research. "I had no idea that recipe appropriation was happening on this scale. The documentation you've assembled reads like an indictment of entire segments of the industry." What Larry didn't know was that he was looking at evidence compiled by Logan's own victims, transformed from broken restaurant owners into credible researchers through months of intensive preparation and strategic positioning. The centerpiece of our exhibit was a timeline showing how Blake Culinary Consulting had systematically targeted female-owned restaurants over the past 5 years. Each case study included photographs of the original restaurants, documentation of the consultation process, and evidence of how traditional recipes had been commercialized without compensation or credit. "The pattern is unmistakable," I explained to a group of culinary school administrators who'd gathered around our display. Independent restaurants with valuable family recipes are approached through seemingly legitimate business partnerships, then gradually stripped of their intellectual property through legal agreements that favor corporate interests. The administrators nodded grimly, recognizing the threat to the cultural preservation work their institutions were trying to support. Several requested copies of our research to share with their students as cautionary examples of predatory business practices in the restaurant industry. But the most powerful validation came from an unexpected source. Jeremy walked past our exhibit booth 20 minutes before Logan's keynote, stopping dead when he recognized my face despite my professional transformation. "Vivian," he said, his voice carrying genuine shock, "what are you doing here?" "Conducting research on recipe appropriation and cultural exploitation in the restaurant industry," I replied, maintaining the calm professionalism I'd practiced for weeks. "I'm Dr. Harrison now, Director of Research for the Traditional Culinary Heritage Foundation." Jeremy's expression shifted through confusion, recognition, and finally something approaching fear, as he understood what our exhibit represented. He'd spent months documenting my emotional attachment to family traditions, assuming that sentimentality would make me vulnerable to manipulation. He'd never imagined that I could transform that attachment into scholarly expertise and professional credibility. "This is," he started, then stopped, clearly struggling to process how the woman he'd systematically destroyed had emerged as a respected researcher at the industry's most important conference.
This is what happens when you underestimate someone's capacity for reinvention, I finished for him. Your keynote speaker is about to deliver an address on preserving authentic cuisine to an audience that's just spent the morning learning about his systematic theft of traditional recipes. Jeremy's face went pale as he realized the trap that was closing around Logan's carefully constructed reputation. Our exhibit hadn't just documented past crimes, it had positioned Logan's keynote address as the perfect platform for exposing his hypocrisy to 3,000 industry professionals. "You can't do this," Jeremy said, his voice carrying the desperation of someone who finally understood the scope of his miscalculation. "Actually, I can. The Traditional Culinary Heritage Foundation is a legitimate research organization contributing to important industry discussions about cultural preservation. Everything we're presenting is documented, verified, and academically sound."
Jeremy looked around at the crowd of food industry professionals studying our research with genuine interest and growing outrage. Restaurant owners recognizing similar patterns in their own experiences. Food critics realizing they'd been unknowingly promoting stolen recipes. Culinary educators understanding the threat to cultural traditions they were trying to preserve. "Logan won't let this stand," Jeremy said, finally. Logan Conrad is about to discover that some traditions are more powerful than corporate legal teams. In 15 minutes, he'll walk onto that stage to deliver a keynote address about authentic cuisine and cultural preservation. And sitting in that audience will be 3,000 people who've just learned about his systematic theft of the very traditions he claims to champion. Jeremy walked away without another word, undoubtedly rushing to warn Logan about the public relations disaster that was about to unfold. But it was too late for damage control. The Traditional Culinary Heritage Foundation had already transformed Logan's moment of triumph into the platform for his professional destruction. As I watched Jeremy disappear into the crowd, I realized that my metamorphosis was complete. I was no longer Vivian Harrison, the emotional chef whose attachment to tradition had made her an easy target for manipulation. I was Dr. Vivian Harrison, a respected researcher who'd turned personal devastation into professional expertise, individual grief into collective action, and private betrayal into public justice. Logan Conrad had destroyed my restaurant, but he'd created something far more dangerous. A woman who understood his methods better than anyone and had the credibility to expose them to the people who mattered most. In 10 minutes, his keynote address would begin, and I'd be sitting in the front row, ready to ask the questions that would end his career. Logan Conrad took the stage with the confident swagger of a man who believed his reputation was unassailable. The convention hall buzzed with 3,000 food industry professionals eager to hear insights from one of the most successful restaurant entrepreneurs in the Midwest. He had no idea that his audience had just spent the morning learning about his systematic theft of traditional recipes. "Authentic cuisine is under threat," Logan began, his voice carrying the passionate conviction of someone genuinely committed to cultural preservation. "In an industry driven by profit margins and efficiency, we're losing the family traditions that make food meaningful. Today, I want to talk about how successful restaurateurs can protect and honor these irreplaceable culinary legacies." The irony was so thick it was suffocating. I sat in the front row with my notebook, documenting every statement that contradicted the evidence we'd assembled about his actual practices. Behind me, food journalists and industry executives listened with genuine interest to his message about preserving authenticity, unaware they were hearing from the man who'd systematically destroyed more traditional restaurants than anyone else in the region. "The key to preserving authentic cuisine," Logan continued, "is finding the right balance between honoring tradition and adapting to modern market realities. Family recipes that remain locked away in single restaurants serve no one when those establishments fail due to poor business practices." Poor business practices. The same phrase Jeremy had used to justify the systematic destruction of Maria's restaurant, Elena's gelato shop, and a dozen other establishments that had been forced out of business by Logan's coordinated pressure campaigns. At Conrad Restaurant Group, we believe that traditional techniques deserve a wider audience. When we partner with family restaurants, we help them scale their operations while maintaining the authentic methods that make their food special. Not acquire, steal, or appropriate, Logan had spent years perfecting the language that made exploitation sound like collaboration. During the question and answer session, I raised my hand and waited for Logan to call on me. When he did, I stood and identified myself clearly. "Dr. Vivian Harrison, Traditional Culinary Heritage Foundation. Mr. Conrad, your message about preserving authentic cuisine is compelling. Could you comment on the Foundation's research showing that Blake Culinary Consulting has been involved in the closure of 15 independent restaurants over the past 5 years, all of which featured traditional family recipes that now appear in Conrad Restaurant Group establishments?" The convention hall fell completely silent. Logan's confident expression faltered for just a moment before he recovered his composure, but I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes as he processed the threat I represented. "I'm not familiar with that specific research," Logan replied carefully. "However, I can say that Blake Culinary Consulting works exclusively with restaurants that voluntarily seek our business partnership services. Any resemblance between traditional techniques and our menu offerings reflects our commitment to authentic preparation methods rather than any form of appropriation." Voluntary partnership services. Even under pressure, Logan maintained the linguistic framework that transformed theft into business consultation. "Dr. Harrison," Logan continued, "could you clarify what methodology your foundation used to determine that restaurant closures were related to our consulting services rather than normal market forces?" It was a smart deflection, challenging my credibility while positioning himself as the reasonable businessman seeking clarification from an academic researcher. But Logan had made one crucial mistake. He'd assumed I was making accusations without evidence. Certainly, our methodology included analysis of business partnership agreements, financial records, supplier contracts, and documented communications between Blake Culinary Consulting and targeted restaurants. We also conducted interviews with former employees, family members, and community leaders who witnessed the systematic extraction of traditional recipes through relationship-based acquisition strategies. The phrase relationship-based acquisition strategies hit Logan like a physical blow. It was taken directly from Jeremy's own business website, the clinical description of how romantic manipulation was used to steal recipes from female chefs. Logan's face went pale as he realized I wasn't just making general accusations. I had specific knowledge of their methods. The Foundation's research documents a pattern where independent restaurants with valuable family recipes are approached through seemingly legitimate business partnerships, then gradually stripped of their intellectual property through legal agreements that transfer cultural heritage to corporate ownership without meaningful compensation. Around the convention hall, food industry professionals were taking notes, asking questions of their neighbors, and pulling out phones to search for information about the traditional Culinary Heritage Foundation. The mood in the room was shifting from polite attention to genuine concern as Logan's practices were exposed to public scrutiny. "Furthermore," I said, "our research reveals that restaurants refusing partnership terms often experience mysterious operational difficulties, including supplier cancellations, health department investigations, and insurance complications that force closure within months of declining Conrad Restaurant Group's offers." Logan's careful composure was cracking under the weight of my systematic exposure. He'd expected questions about business practices, maybe some challenges about authenticity claims. He hadn't anticipated a comprehensive indictment of his entire operation delivered by someone with academic credentials and documented evidence. "Dr. Harrison, these are serious allegations," Logan said, trying to regain control of the narrative. "I hope your foundation has thoroughly verified this information before presenting it to industry professionals." "Absolutely. Our documentation includes over 300 pages of evidence spanning 5 years of Blake Culinary Consulting's operations. The Traditional Culinary Heritage Foundation stands behind our research methodology and findings." The damage was already done. Regardless of how Logan responded, 3,000 food industry professionals had just learned that the man delivering a keynote about preserving authentic cuisine was systematically stealing traditional recipes from the very communities he claimed to support. As Logan struggled to formulate a response that wouldn't further incriminate him, I realized that our months of preparation had achieved something more powerful than revenge. We'd transformed personal devastation into professional accountability, individual grief into institutional change. Logan Conrad had built his empire by isolating his victims and controlling the narrative around his practices. But the Traditional Culinary Heritage Foundation had brought his crimes into the light where they couldn't be dismissed, minimized, or explained away. His keynote address about authentic cuisine had become his public confession. The aftermath of Logan's keynote was swift and devastating. Within hours, food journalists were calling for statements, culinary school administrators were questioning their relationships with Conrad Restaurant Group, and restaurant investors were demanding explanations about the systematic theft allegations. But the most damaging blow came from an unexpected source. During the evening networking reception, 3 more women approached our exhibit booth with stories that followed the same predatory pattern Logan had perfected over the years. "I saw your presentation this morning," said Lorelei Blake, a pastry chef from Seattle whose French bakery had closed 6 months earlier. "Everything you described happened to my family's patisserie. The consultation meetings, the gradual extraction of our techniques, the mysterious supplier problems when we tried to back out." Her testimony provided real-time validation of our research, demonstrating that Logan's theft wasn't historical misconduct but ongoing criminal activity. Word spread quickly through the conference networking events, and by evening, Logan found himself isolated at industry gatherings where he'd once been the center of attention. Jeremy approached me during the final reception, his confident demeanor replaced by desperate calculation. "Vivian, this has gone far enough. Logan is prepared to offer a settlement that would compensate you and the other women for any perceived damages." Perceived damages? Even facing professional ruin, Jeremy couldn't acknowledge that actual crimes had been committed. "The Traditional Culinary Heritage Foundation isn't interested in settlements," I replied. "We're interested in systemic change that protects future victims from the practices you and Logan have perfected." "What do you want?" "Full disclosure of every restaurant Blake Culinary Consulting has targeted, return of stolen recipes to their original creators, and establishment of an industry fund to compensate victims of recipe appropriation." Jeremy's expression showed he understood the scope of what I was demanding, not just acknowledgement of past theft, but complete dismantling of the empire he and Logan had built through systematic exploitation. "That's impossible. It would destroy everything we've worked for." "Everything you've stolen, you mean?" As Jeremy walked away, I realized that our exposure had achieved something more significant than destroying Logan's reputation. We'd created a new framework for understanding recipe appropriation as cultural theft rather than business competition, giving future victims the language and evidence they'd need to fight back effectively. Logan Conrad's empire wasn't just cracking under external pressure, it was collapsing from within as suppliers, partners, and employees began questioning their association with systematic cultural exploitation. The secret ingredient in our revenge hadn't been elaborate planning or devastating evidence. It had been the simple power of women refusing to stay isolated and silent about the crimes committed against them. Logan had built his success by ensuring his victims never connected with each other, never understood the scope of his operations, never had the resources to fight back effectively. Our foundation had changed all of that forever. The breakthrough came 3 days after the conference when Bella Conrad arrived at Maria's community kitchen carrying a box of documents that would seal Logan's fate permanently. Her face was pale but determined as she placed the evidence on our work table. "I can't be part of this anymore," she said. "These are Blake Culinary Consulting's internal files going back 4 years. Every Target restaurant, every stolen recipe, every pressure campaign they orchestrated." The documents were devastating. Detailed profiles of female-owned restaurants with analysis of their acquisition potential, strategic timelines for extracting recipes through romantic manipulation, financial projections showing expected profits from commercializing stolen family techniques. But the most damaging evidence was a series of recorded conversations between Logan and Jeremy discussing their methods with clinical detachment. Jeremy's voice describing how emotional attachment to traditional recipes made women vulnerable to relationship-based extraction strategies. Logan explaining how regulatory pressure could force compliance from uncooperative targets. "There's more," Bella continued, pulling out her phone. "I've been recording every planning meeting for the past 6 months. Logan never suspected that his protege was documenting his criminal conspiracy." She played a recording from 2 weeks ago where Logan discussed their strategy for discrediting our foundation's research. His voice was clear as he described plans to portray us as bitter ex-partners making unfounded accusations while using his industry connections to minimize media coverage of our allegations. "The Harrison woman thinks she's destroyed me," Logan's recorded voice said. "She has no idea how many journalists and critics depend on our advertising revenue. This story dies in 48 hours." But Logan had miscalculated the power of documented evidence presented by credible sources. Within hours of receiving Bella's recordings, 3 major food publications were preparing investigative pieces about systematic recipe theft in the restaurant industry. The final piece of evidence that would end Logan's career came from an unexpected source. Amanda, my former sous chef, had been quietly gathering information about Jeremy's activities since Harrison's Kitchen closed. She'd maintained contact with suppliers, industry colleagues, and restaurant staff who'd witnessed Blake Culinary Consulting's methods firsthand. "Chef Vivian," Amanda said when she called that evening, "I have something you need to see. Remember that health inspector who shut down your restaurant, Inspector Morrison? He's been taking payments from Conrad Restaurant Group for conducting targeted inspections of restaurants that refuse their partnership offers." The corruption went deeper than systematic recipe theft. Logan had been bribing health officials, manipulating insurance companies, and coordinating supplier boycotts to force independent restaurants into accepting his terms. The evidence Amanda had assembled showed a pattern of racketeering that violated federal laws governing interstate commerce. "How did you find this?" I asked. "Inspector Morrison's ex-wife works at the health department. She came forward after seeing your presentation at the conference. She's been documenting the payments for months, waiting for someone with credibility to expose the corruption." We now had everything needed to destroy Logan's empire completely: documented recipe theft, recorded conspiracy conversations, evidence of bribery and regulatory corruption, and testimony from dozens of victims whose restaurants had been systematically destroyed. The Traditional Culinary Heritage Foundation's research had evolved from academic documentation into a federal criminal case that would make Logan Conrad face consequences he'd never imagined possible. Jeremy called that night, his voice carrying the desperation of someone who finally understood the scope of their exposure. "Vivian, Logan's willing to dissolve Blake Culinary Consulting and return all disputed recipes to their original creators. Full compensation, public apology, whatever you want." "It's too late for negotiations, Jeremy. The Traditional Culinary Heritage Foundation is turning our evidence over to federal investigators tomorrow morning." The silence on the other end told me everything I needed to know. Logan's empire wasn't just cracking under pressure, it was about to be dismantled by the same legal system he'd been manipulating to destroy his victims. My secret ingredient had been patience, preparation, and the power of women who refused to stay silent about crimes committed against them. Logan Conrad was about to discover that some recipes can't be stolen, only earned through decades of genuine dedication to the craft. The federal courtroom was packed with food industry professionals, journalists, and victims of Logan Conrad's systematic theft when I took the witness stand 6 months later. As lead researcher for the Traditional Culinary Heritage Foundation, I was testifying in the criminal case that would determine whether Logan and Jeremy faced decades in prison for racketeering, fraud, and conspiracy. "Dr. Harrison," the prosecutor began, "please explain to the jury how you first became aware of the defendant's criminal enterprise." I looked directly at Jeremy, sitting at the defense table in an expensive suit that couldn't hide the fact that his entire world was collapsing. Logan sat beside him, no longer the confident entrepreneur who delivered keynote addresses about authentic cuisine, but a broken man facing the consequences of years of systematic exploitation. "I discovered their crimes when they targeted my restaurant and my marriage," I said clearly. "Jeremy Blake spent 8 years documenting my family's traditional recipes while posing as my loving husband. Logan Conrad's organization had been planning to steal my grandmother's culinary techniques and commercialize them without compensation or credit." The prosecutor led me through our evidence methodically. The recorded conversations where Logan and Jeremy discussed targeting female chefs through relationship-based acquisition strategies. The financial documents showing how stolen recipes generated millions in revenue for Conrad Restaurant Group. The testimony from dozens of women whose restaurants had been systematically destroyed when they refused to surrender their family's culinary heritage. The defendants didn't just steal recipes, I explained to the jury. They destroyed entire communities' connections to their cultural traditions. When you commercialize a grandmother's technique without understanding its history or meaning, you're not preserving authenticity, you're erasing it. During cross-examination, Logan's attorney tried to portray our foundation as a group of bitter ex-business partners seeking revenge against successful entrepreneurs. Dr. Harrison, isn't it true that your organization was formed specifically to target my client after your own restaurant failed due to normal market forces? The Traditional Culinary Heritage Foundation was formed to document and prevent the systematic theft of cultural property from independent restaurants, I replied. Mr. Conrad's criminal enterprise wasn't normal market forces. It was organized crime disguised as business consultation. The attorney pressed harder. But you personally benefited from destroying my client's reputation, didn't you? Your foundation has received significant donations and media attention as a result of these accusations. I paused, thinking about everything we'd lost and gained through this ordeal. Harrison's Kitchen was gone forever. My marriage to Jeremy had been revealed as an 8-year deception. The life I'd built before Logan's theft seemed like it belonged to someone else entirely. What I gained, I said finally, was the understanding that some things are more important than individual success. Traditional recipes represent generations of family history, cultural survival, and community identity. When someone steals those techniques for profit, they're not just harming individual restaurants, they're committing cultural genocide. The courtroom fell silent as the weight of that statement settled over the jury. This wasn't just a business dispute or a case of recipe plagiarism. It was a systematic campaign to extract cultural heritage from vulnerable communities and profit from traditions that had sustained families for generations. When the verdict came 3 days later, Logan Conrad was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for racketeering, conspiracy, and fraud. Jeremy received 8 years for his role in the conspiracy. Blake Culinary Consulting was ordered to pay $47 million in restitution to victims whose restaurants had been destroyed. But the most meaningful victory came from the industry changes our foundation had sparked. The National Restaurant Association established new ethical guidelines for recipe sharing and cultural appropriation. Culinary schools began teaching courses on protecting traditional techniques from commercial exploitation. Food critics started investigating the origins of authentic dishes before reviewing restaurants claiming traditional methods. As I walked out of the courthouse that day, I realized that my transformation was complete. I was no longer Vivian Harrison, the chef whose emotional attachment to tradition had made her vulnerable to manipulation. I was Dr. Vivian Harrison, whose dedication to protecting cultural heritage had changed an entire industry's understanding of what authentic cuisine really means. Jeremy had tried to steal my identity and commercialize my family's legacy. Instead, he'd helped me become someone more powerful than I'd ever imagined possible. The secret ingredient he'd never learned to recognize was the transformative power of women who refuse to let their stories end with someone else's betrayal. 2 years later, I stood in the kitchen of the Traditional Culinary Heritage Center, watching Maria teach a class of 20 immigrant women how to document and protect their family recipes from commercial exploitation. The converted warehouse had become something Logan Conrad never could have imagined. A thriving community space where traditional techniques were preserved through education rather than extraction. The restitution money from Logan's conviction had funded the center's establishment, along with similar facilities in Phoenix, Albuquerque, and Portland. Each location offered free classes in food safety, business planning, and intellectual property protection, ensuring that future generations of family restaurants would be equipped to resist predatory practices. Chef Vivian, Maria called from across the kitchen, Mrs. Rodriguez wants to know about trademarking her grandmother's tamale recipe. I smiled, watching the elderly woman carefully writing down instructions for protecting her family's culinary heritage. 2 years ago, she would have been vulnerable to the same manipulation tactics that had destroyed so many restaurants. Now, she understood that traditional recipes had legal value and could be protected from commercial appropriation. The center had documented over 300 traditional recipes in its first year, creating a digital archive that preserved authentic techniques while ensuring the creators maintained ownership and control. Food historians from universities across the country used our research to understand how immigrant communities had maintained cultural identity through cuisine. But the most meaningful transformation had been personal. Amanda had joined our staff as head of operations, bringing organizational skills that had turned my vision into a sustainable reality. Elena ran our gelato preservation program, teaching artisanal techniques to small business owners who wanted to honor traditional methods. Carmen managed our outreach to Latino communities, ensuring that family recipes were protected rather than appropriated. Even Bella had found redemption through our work. After testifying against Logan and Jeremy, she'd enrolled in culinary school and now specialized in documenting authentic Italian-American techniques that had been lost to commercialization. Her grandmother's recipes had been returned to her family and were featured prominently in our heritage collection. The industry changes we'd sparked continued expanding beyond our initial goals. 3 major restaurant chains had been forced to remove traditional dishes from their menus after investigations revealed they were based on stolen techniques. Food critics now routinely asked about recipe origins before reviewing establishments claiming cultural authenticity. Jeremy had been released from prison 6 months early for good behavior, but his career in food service was permanently destroyed. Blake Culinary Consulting had been dissolved, its assets liquidated to pay restitution to victims. Logan remained incarcerated, his restaurant empire sold to pay legal judgments and criminal fines. That evening, I found myself alone in the center's main kitchen, working with my grandmother's sourdough starter that had survived everything Jeremy and Logan had tried to steal. The culture was thriving, more active and flavorful than it had been during the stressful months when Harrison's kitchen was under attack. As I shaped bread for tomorrow's community meal, I reflected on how completely my life had transformed. The woman who'd built Harrison's kitchen was talented but naive, trusting others with her most precious secrets without understanding how that vulnerability could be exploited. Dr. Vivian Harrison was different, stronger, more aware of how power operated in professional relationships, but also more connected to community, more committed to ensuring that other women didn't face the same systematic exploitation that had nearly destroyed me. My phone buzzed with a text from a food journalist in Atlanta. Dr. Harrison, we're investigating a restaurant group that may be using stolen recipes from African American family establishments. Would the Traditional Culinary Heritage Foundation be willing to consult on this story? I smiled, already mentally planning our response. Logan Conrad and Jeremy Blake had thought they could steal my identity and profit from my family's legacy. Instead, they'd helped create something more powerful than they could have imagined, a network of women who understood their methods and had the resources to stop them. Some recipes, I'd learned, become more potent when they're shared with the right people. The secret ingredient Logan had never tasted was the transformative power of community, and now that recipe was being passed to every woman who needed it. The Traditional Culinary Heritage Foundation's work was just beginning. 5 years after Jeremy first demanded I cook for his girlfriend's family, I stood in the kitchen of Harrison's Heritage, the restaurant I'd opened on the site where my original establishment had been destroyed. But this wasn't just a return to my old life. It was something entirely new. The dining room buzzed with conversation in 6 different languages as families from Denver's immigrant communities gathered for our weekly community dinner. Each table featured dishes prepared by women who'd learned to protect their recipes through our foundation's programs. Mrs. Chen served hand-pulled noodles her grandmother had taught her in Shanghai. Rosa Martinez offered tamales made with techniques passed down through 4 generations. Fatima Al-Hassan shared her mother's Lebanese kibbeh, prepared exactly as it had been in Beirut decades ago. But these weren't stolen recipes commercialized for profit. They were freely shared traditions, prepared by their creators and served with stories about the families and histories that made each dish meaningful. The women who cooked here owned their techniques, controlled their presentation, and received full credit and compensation for their cultural contributions. Chef Vivian, Amanda called from the pass, where she now served as executive chef while I focused on the foundation's expansion. Table 7 wants to know if you'll share the story about your grandmother's sourdough starter. I smiled, wiping my hands on the apron that bore the traditional Culinary Heritage Foundation's logo instead of my personal name. The sourdough culture bubbled peacefully in its new home, thriving in an environment where its history was respected rather than exploited. Walking to Table 7, I found a young culinary student and her parents, all eager to understand how traditional techniques survived and evolved across generations. As I told them about my grandmother's journey from Italy to America, about the cultures and communities that had sustained her starter through 70 years of change, I realized how completely my understanding of success had transformed. 5 years ago, I'd measured achievement through restaurant reviews, profit margins, and professional recognition. I'd built Harrison's Kitchen to establish my reputation as a chef worthy of respect and admiration. But Logan and Jeremy Steft had taught me that individual success meant nothing if it wasn't connected to community, purpose, and the protection of something larger than personal ambition. Harrison's heritage operated on different principles. We showcased traditional techniques without appropriating them. We celebrated cultural heritage without commercializing it. We created space for authentic stories to be told by the people who'd lived them rather than the entrepreneurs who wanted to profit from them. The foundation had grown beyond anything I'd imagined when we'd started documenting Logan's crimes. We now operated centers in 12 cities, had documented over 2,000 traditional recipes, and had trained hundreds of women to recognize and resist culinary exploitation. Food historians cited our research in academic papers about cultural preservation. Legal scholars referenced our work in intellectual property cases involving traditional knowledge. But the most meaningful measure of our success came from the women we'd helped protect their culinary heritage. Like Sarah Kim, who'd learned to trademark her grandmother's Korean barbecue techniques before opening her restaurant. Or Isabella Santos, who'd used our legal resources to stop a major food corporation from appropriating her family's salsa recipe. Or the dozens of immigrant women who now understood that their traditional techniques had commercial value and legal protection. As I returned to the kitchen that night, I found a handwritten note from one of our community dinner guests. "Dr. Harrison," it read, "my grandmother's recipes were stolen by a restaurant chain in Phoenix 3 years ago. I thought they were lost forever. After learning about your foundation tonight, I understand that her techniques aren't gone. They live in my hands, my memory, and my family's continuing story. Thank you for teaching me that some things can never really be stolen." I folded the note carefully and placed it in the collection I kept of letters from women whose lives had been touched by our work. Each one reminded me that the real secret ingredient in any meaningful recipe wasn't technique or tradition or even love. It was the understanding that some things become more powerful when they're shared with people who truly comprehend their value. Jeremy had tried to steal my identity and commercialize my family's legacy. Logan had attempted to destroy my restaurant and appropriate my cultural heritage. Instead, they'd helped me discover that the most satisfying revenge was building something so meaningful that their crimes became irrelevant. Harrison's heritage served its last customers of the evening as I cleaned my grandmother's sourdough starter and prepared it for another night of peaceful fermentation. Tomorrow, I'd use it to make bread for women who were learning to protect their own family traditions from those who would exploit them. The secret ingredient they'd never understood was that some recipes improve with age, become stronger under pressure, and transform even the most devastating betrayal into nourishment for others who need hope. My story wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about renewal, community, and the power of women who refuse to let their heritage be stolen without fighting back. And that recipe, I knew, would feed generations of families who deserved to own their own stories.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.